On today's episode of Locked On Lightning, the Bolts are back in action tomorrow night against the New York Rangers. We talk about that matchup as well as the other in the Big Apple, as well as who is set to have a big second half of the season, as well as where will the Bolts end up when it's all said and done. All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Tanger. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Locked On Lightning. And just a reminder that today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On this episode of Locked On Lightning, the Bolts are back in action finally. It seems like an eternity since this team was on the ice, as well as we're talking about, individual players who could possibly be set for a big last 32 games of the season, as well as where can the Lightning, or where will the Lightning end up when the regular season is over. We try our best to predict that on this episode. But first, I must ask all of you, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube, so go ahead, subscribe to the channel, hit the thumbs up button below this video, and comment below to get in on the conversation. Let us know, where will the Lightning end up when the regular season is over? But before we get into that, let's start off at the top. The Lightning are back in action tomorrow night against the New York Rangers, and they have a little short back-to-back here in the Big Apple. Unfortunately, I will not be attending any of those games. Usually every year, if you've been a follower of this podcast for quite some time, I at least try to go to one game when they're up here near me. And unfortunately, I think it was last year or the year before, actually, 2 years ago, I was really fortunate enough to go to the game in which they played at the Garden, both games in which they were actually probably all three games when they were in Jersey, when they were on the island, and when, of course, they were at the Garden. This year, that is not the case. Unfortunately, I have other things going on that I cannot grab my attention from, take my attention from, but I will be watching the game. But it's a big game, big couple of games coming up for the Tampa Bay Lightning as they come back from their incredibly long All-Star break. I feel like it's been for this team, but they'll be back in action tomorrow night against the Rangers. They'll be playing the Islanders the following night on the island, and then out to Columbus. But we're not going to get to Columbus at all right now. But like I stated, very big set of games for the Tampa Bay Lightning coming up. They're facing up against the Rangers, who really have been a disappointment for me. I think just because, and this was a game that I circled on the calendar some time ago, because at that point in time, the Rangers were one of the best teams in the NHL, in my opinion. Then, as of now, I don't think that's really the case. They're really, if you look at them in terms of points, they're seventh in the league, and their last 10 games are really less than you would expect out of a team that you would expect to be kind of vying for a championship this year. They're 5-4-1. Losses going to San Jose, Washington, Vegas twice, and the Kings. And you look at some of those wins. You got good wins there: Colorado, Ottawa, Anaheim, Seattle, and Washington. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because I think it's very important when you look at teams across the NHL. And I know this isn't really something that is really spoken about that much, but I think that when we evaluate teams, especially their last 10 and who they play and what that record is against those last 10 teams, uh, it really gives you an insight to how well they're playing. And I think that strength of schedule, and it is a stat if you look on NHL hockey reference, it is a stat, not something that I think a lot of people really take a look at. But I think that it is something that especially when you, like I said, you look at the last 10 for any team, it kind of gives you an insight as to what, um, where this team is at. For example, on Hockey Reference, so the average schedule, and it's denominated in goals above and below average, and where 0 is average. The Lightning, their strength of schedule is 0.05, so they're a little bit above average in terms of their strength of schedule. But when I look at what kind of team we're going to get from this Rangers team tomorrow night, because we kind of know at this point who the Lightning are. We know what kind of team they are. We kind of know what to expect out of them. I mean, that's not without saying that it's a very good chance that this team could go out and score 8 goals tomorrow night. They could play a very close game, or they could completely roll over and die in the opening minutes of the first period. And then we're stuck here talking about how this team is completely back to square one, and what in God's name is Julian Brisebois going to do come the deadline that's only about a month out for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I think in this scenario, I think that as much as we could focus, obviously this is a Lightning podcast, as much as we want to focus on, how the Lightning are going to react, how are they going to be able to do this, that, and the other thing, I think the Rangers, given their schedule, given the fact that they have very much taken a step back in their recent games, I think that when you look at these two teams, and I'm not being biased here, I firmly believe it, when you look at these two teams, record aside, and being in New York, I'm able to watch the Rangers very often. I can tell you from firsthand experience that, and I'm sure John Chick from Locked On Rangers has maybe a different opinion, but when you look at these two teams, I firmly believe the Lightning are a better team. They have a better foundation of veterans, or I want to say veterans because a lot of these guys, when I think of veterans, I think of guys that are kind of towards the end of their career, or maybe towards the middle of their career, where I don't feel like we have that on this team. We just have very experienced players. Whereas the Rangers have a ton of youth. They have a ton of players that are just, you still don't know what you're going to get from them. Whereas kind of like the Lightning know what they have. And the thing that's really going to be interesting for me when we watch this game tomorrow night is going to be the goaltending situation. Now, I would probably bet $1 million if I had it in my pocket that we're going to see the two Russians tomorrow night, Vasilevsky and Shesterkin, who, ironically, as much as Ranger fans want to say that Igor is better, I mean, you look at the numbers, and granted, I think Igor Shesterkin was also out for a little while too as well, but I mean, these guys, not much separates them in the stat department. Vasilevsky comes into this one 16-10-0. Igor is coming into this one 19-12-1. Vasilevsky has a goals against average of 2.85. Shesterkin is 2.86. And they both have a save percentage of 8.99. So really not a whole bunch of difference here and there. Really, so it's not your stereotypical Lightning Rangers game where you're going to see these two teams battle it out between the pipes. That's really not what's going to happen. This is going to be a game that's going to be won in the nitty gritty. And the one player, when I look at this game, that really kind of makes me nervous, and I know that the Lightning are kind of past this, and they have enough players to where these two players, and it's not just one player, it's a couple of players, but really the guy that really kind of raises my eyebrows, especially anytime uh, a Lightning player of any kind of higher standing. So I guess Kucherov or, you know, Point, or we could even see Stamkos, or a guy that's just having a good night. Um, Jacob Trouba is going to be that guy that is going to try and ruffle the feathers of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And it's going to be interesting for me to see who steps up to the plate in terms of stepping up to him, because that's really is what is going to be really going to be the factor that's going to hold him at bay. I mean, I expect Tanner Jeannot to play tomorrow night. I haven't heard anything about him possibly coming back, but I mean, he's been out since January 6th with a lower body injury. I didn't see anything that says that he's coming back, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're looking at the warm ups tomorrow night and he is warming up and going to play. But really, what this comes down to, real quick, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Really, what it comes down to, quick, is that the Lightning need to get off to a good start, not only in this game, but in the final 32 games of the regular season. We'll talk more about that in the final, in the next segment about the final 32 games. But really, the Lightning need to win the game within the game. The Garden's going to be rocking tomorrow night. A lot of people, a lot of Ranger fans are still pissed about how they lost in the playoffs and the conference finals to the Lightning a couple of years ago. And I'm sure they're going to hear it. And, the second Shesterkin makes a save, we're going to hear Igor's better, especially if Vasilevsky's given up a goal. So this is not going to be your stereotypical matchup of goaltenders. It's going to be, the game won by the depth guys, the Nick Pauls, the Brandon Hagels, the Tanner Jeannots. It's all hands on deck, and it's going to be a crazy playoff-like environment tomorrow night in New York City. So let me know in the comments below, what are your predictions for this game, as well as what you're looking to see out of this Lightning team as they kick off the second half of the NHL season. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about who's ready for a big half. We're talking players, who could it be? A little bit of a spoiler alert. I'm going to say Nick Paul and Anthony Cirelli. But before we get into all that, I want to talk about our first sponsor of the day, and that is our friends over at FanDuel. Now, listen up, people. It's Super Bowl week. You know the drill. You got prop bets, you got spreads, parlays. They got it all. And what better way to celebrate for all those who observe Super Bowl week than to celebrate with our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Now, if you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. In my family, it is almost a religious observance in Super Bowl Sunday. And we do parlays, we do prop bets, we do it religiously, and you can too with FanDuel. Now, FanDuel has so many ways for you to end the season with a W or two or three. You could bet a bunch of things on this Super Bowl 58 game. 58 game, which players will score a touchdown, how many points will be scored. I'm sure at some point they'll even have how many times the camera cuts to Taylor Swift. New customers join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more. FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and hit us up with your feelings about this upcoming game, as well as also, we're talking now who is set for a big half. The Lightning have played 50 games thus far this season, which by math, if you're aware that they play 82, then that only leaves them 32. So who are we looking at? Who are we looking now? We know Kucherov's going to play well. He's going to continue to possibly, I hopefully win the Hart Trophy. I think that if he doesn't win the Hart Trophy, I think the voting system really needs to be reevaluated. I don't care. I mean, if I sound biased, I sound biased, but it really needs. The guy has been really phenomenal for this Lightning team all year. But you know, putting him aside because we have spoken about him quite a bit on the show, we're looking at other players on this team that are set to have a big half, a big second half of the season, and really the Lightning are going to need that from these guys. And the two guys that stick out to me, like I hinted at before, are going to be uh, Brandon Hagel, Nick Paul, and Anthony Cirelli, especially now. Brandon Hagel, I've spoken about quite a bit, how really he is just a player that he's kind of like, to me, and maybe some other Lightning fans might see this comparison, some others might not. He's kind of like Braden Point's second coming. That's just how I feel about it. I just feel like the trajectory kind of very slept on, immensely talented player, and he's going to be one of those guys to where until he continuously hurts a bunch of other teams around the league, you're not going to know who he is. And I think that's how really, you saw with Braden Point, what he did in the playoffs for 3-4 years. It wasn't until probably that third or fourth year that really teams or really the NHL in general, in terms of the media, they started to understand and realize who this guy was. And so I think that's going to be the same thing with Brandon Hagel. And I think that right now, as he sits, he is at 16 games, 43 points. And I really think that, I would really like to see him at 90 to end the year in the points standings. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is. Things could drastically change. Like I said, the Lightning have played 50 games thus far this year. They have far less games to do that. So, realistically speaking, he'll probably end up with 75. I think that's probably a good marker for him. If he could get up to 75, 80 and maybe get to 25, 30 goals, I think that would be a phenomenal season for him, especially where there has been so much juggling of this lineup this year. There's been so much kind of up and down for a lot of guys on this lineup for this year in terms of kind of just moving things here around there and I really think that Brandon Hagel, for this Lightning team to be successful in the second half of the season, I think he's going to be a huge part of it, as well as Nick Paul, who we try to talk about him as much as possible on this show. The guy is really just the personification of a Swiss Army knife, really, when it comes down to it. The guy does everything well. I mean, from scoring goals, which he has 13 of thus far this year through 50 games, 27 points, and his face-off percentage is phenomenal. He's at 54% this year, which is really just something that, if it weren't for Luke Glendening really doing a phenomenal job this year with kind of being that guy in the face-off circle, just dominating. I mean, really, just Nick Paul would really be, I think, talked a lot more in terms of just a phenomenal player. I mean, as he is already. I mean, we are talking about him. We talk about him quite a bit on this podcast, but really, I think that Nick Paul, when I look at Nick Paul and I think about like what can he contribute to this team, what is his ceiling, I think that the only ceiling you could have for Nick Paul is the one that this team, in terms of how they play around him, as well as what John Cooper plans to do on a nightly basis, is that's really the only thing that could hold him back at this point. I mean, the guy right now is playing on the first line with Braden Point and Nikita Kucherov. I don't know how many people at the start of the season really thought that he was going to be in that spot. I really thought, we spoke for a long time that it was probably going to be Hagel, Point, and Coach. But like I said, this roster has really shuffled around quite a bit, and the fact that Nick Paul has played himself onto the first line with Point and Coach, I mean, really says a lot about not only how well he's played this year, but uh, what he has done this year to instill that faith in John Cooper to almost allow him to be able to play at the top line. So that really tells you a lot, and a lot of people, don't realize, Nick Paul has not been here for that long, only a couple of seasons, and the fact that we're talking about him, especially now that he's been extended, but now that we're already kind of looking at him as an all-time, well, as the next generation, I'm not going to say all-time great just yet, but um, that he is the next generation of Bolts players, the next foundation, part of that really says a lot about how much he means to this team. And, you'll see it on a nightly basis how much he means to this team and how much he's going to mean to this team down this 32 game stretch that is the second half of the NHL season for the Tampa Bay Lightning. And finally, we're looking at Anthony Cirelli. I really think that Tony C has just he's continued to impress me on a yearly basis, and really this year I thought he was going to really um, take his play up to another level. I mean, stats wise, he hasn't really done that. I mean, it is what it is. I'm not going to get crazy about it, but listen, the important thing is that for the most part, he has stayed healthy. 49 games this year, 10 goals, 25 points. His face-off percentage is at 48.9%, which I'll take that. I'll take that as a win-win, because Tony Cirelli, as much as I would love him to morph into kind of what the player that we've seen, kind of maybe midway between a Nick Paul and a Brandon Hagel in terms of scoring. I would like, if he's going to be that guy that's going to be the anchor down the middle, who eventually, let's face it, is going to be a first line center at some point in the future. Um, Now, as for that headache that might possibly stem from that in the future, is a whole nother conversation to be had. But he's going to be a guy that's really going to have to his main focus going down uh, the rest of the season, as well as when we get into the playoffs, is that he's going to lock down or have to lock down the other big time centers in the league. And this day and age, that's no easy feat when you have a ton of guys in this league who could really hurt you in a lot of ways and also play down the middle. So, especially those games where you'll get the superstar centers or the superstar forwards, guys who like to play down low, down the middle, and whether they're predominantly outside wingers or inside. It's going to be up to Anthony Cirelli. That's really going to have to lock that down. So let me know how you feel about that. I mean, are we missing something here with another player? Possibly. I'm sure we are, because you know what? There are a lot of players on this team that I think could very much make a huge impact down the stretch. I mean, the one player that I'm going to mention is an honorable mention real quick before we go into the break and wrap things up is Mikey Esamont. I mean, Mikey Esamont is probably, outside of the stars on this team, is probably one of my favorite players on this team just to watch, because he has, I think, one moment per game in which it's like, whether it's scoring or almost scoring, where he shows us that skill that you would not expect out of him, where I don't think any of us expect that out of him. And not even if it comes to scoring, that level of play, whether it be defensively or along the boards or whatever the case may be, he showed flashes of a guy who could potentially and eventually be a top player on this team. So a very exciting player, very exciting second half of the season about to kick off tomorrow night. And let me know your thoughts and predictions on that. So coming up in just a bit, we're going to talk about where will the Lightning end up when it's all said and done in just a bit. But first, I want to talk about our last sponsor of today's show, and that is our friends over at the Sleeper app. Now, it is the halfway point of the NHL season, Lightning fans, and I think that Nick Paul and Brandon Hagel and Tony Cirelli are about to kick it off with a bang in the next couple of games. But regardless of where we are in the standings, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you could win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. Now, all you have to do is pick those three studs that I just listed off to you: Anthony Sorelli, Nick Paul, and Brandon Hagel, to record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. So use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a 100%, $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleepers terms of use for details and locational availability. So as always, I want to thank everybody one last time for making us your first listen of the day. And I want to thank you, the everyday listener who's been tuning in with us since day one, as well as you who might be joining us, the first timer, for the first time with our podcast. And as always, one last time, I want to remind both of you to go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. You could also follow us on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, drop a comment below. So we're wrapping things up here on the show by talking about where the Lightning could realistically end up when the regular season concludes. And, there's two sides to it for me. The one side is wishful thinking, and the other side is kind of just trying to be positive, but there's that negative side that always creeps in. If you've been a listener of this podcast, you're very familiar with it. So the positive side is that the Lightning stay where they are in the divisional race. They fight tooth and nail with Toronto and Detroit to hang on to that third spot. Now, anything more than that is phenomenal, and at that point you're just playing with house money, because I don't think at certain points this season that we kind of figured that, or would have thought that the Lightning were going to be in a spot to do any of that. And as for the negative side, a part of me can't help but think or hope not, or foresee, or whatever term or phrase you like to use for that. I cannot sit back and fully expect the Lightning will have a problem-free, bumpy-free second half of the season without there being a couple of hiccups. And when I say hiccups, I mean ugly games. And I think that we're going to have a couple of times for the second half where the Lightning it's kind of going to be a little bit more of what we saw in the first half. And what I mean by that is that there are going to be weeks, because that's just how the NHL season unfolds when you're in a tight race. There are going to be times where we're going to go through a week, maybe a week or so, even though the Lightning might be separated only by 2 points, 3 points, maybe even 4. There's going to be times where the Lightning are not going to be in the playoff race, or they might be just hanging on by a thread in the wild card. And it's one of those things where I think we just need to expect it by now. I think that, though, I will say the one difference maker could very well be if Andre Vasilevsky suddenly awakens a couple of times every couple of weeks and becomes a Vezina Trophy goaltender. And what I mean is that he comes out and he completely shuts down the other team. Like I stated on the last podcast and several previous ones, I don't believe we're going to see that Vasilevsky maybe in the playoffs when they get there and when those games start being played. But really, at the end of the day, my prediction for this Tampa Bay Lightning team is that they will make the playoffs. I think that they have proven enough to not only us, but me as well, that they are a team that, when the circumstances are right, which they are right now, and on top of that, like I said on the last podcast, you're getting 2 very highly skilled defensemen back that you have not had for quite some time. You get those two guys back, Um, and especially you're coming out of the break in which you went into with a very good record. I think that that spells success for the Tampa Bay Lightning. I think that they will stay in the third spot. As for if they're going to make a play at the Panthers, Panthers are just too good. They're just too good. I think they're a team. They're a team that does scare me. A team that I hope, if the standings could stay or work themselves out, that the Lightning won't have to play this team until uh, the second round of the playoffs. If the Lightning do make it past the first round, which is, as we all know at this point, is not a given anymore for this Tampa Bay Lightning team. Um, but I think that the Lightning will make the playoffs. I think that they will continue to play well. But in classic Lightning fashion, there will be a good, I would say, a handful of ugly games in which we'll say, this is the team that we're going to go into the playoffs with. I think that they will also make a move at the deadline. I don't think it's going to be Sean Walker like we talked about on the last podcast, but I think it's going to be a couple of, I think it will be, if not a few, depth pieces, especially on the defensive side, that they will need heading down the stretch into the end of the regular season. So I think, I'm staying right now. The Lightning are going to hold on to this third spot in the Atlantic Division. They're going to keep fending off the Maple Leafs. They're going to keep fending off the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings will run out of steam. They're a young team, very talented, but they will run out of steam. And the Lightning will at least won't have to worry about them, which is good because if you've been a listener for a while, you know that the Red Wings scare the crap out of me more than probably the Maple Leafs do. So we'll be back tomorrow to talk about hopefully a win against the New York Rangers, as well as more uh, that come from that game, as well as the upcoming game afterwards against the New York Islanders. So in the meantime, I want to remind you one last time, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed, and hit that notification button so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified and you'll be able to listen to it. So that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Tanker. I'll talk to you in the next one.